Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Managers Too Busy Being Busy, Free Up Frontline Capacity with a New Approach to Operations Management. I'm Diana Davis, editor of PEXNetwork.com. Frontline managers are the critical link in organizational performance, but they often have to spend their time firefighting and they're too busy to do anything about it. So what can you do to break the too busy being busy cycle? Well, presenting today's webinar to take us through an approach that they call Active Operations Management are Eric Sharp and Richard Jeffrey. Eric Sharp is a director at Active Operations Management. Eric is an accomplished strategist, consultant, and solution specialist who has worked for over 2 decades within major corporations to find both technological and non-technological enhancements that help drive productivity improvements. Presenting alongside Eric is Richard Jeffrey, who is co-founder of AOM International and an expert in service operations management. Finally, we will also have a special guest joining the program to answer questions about how he has applied the concepts in active operations management to his business. Arvind Imanini is Head of Deposit Operations at TD Bank, where he is responsible for the various operational functions that support the bank's $170 billion plus in deposits, including distribution, mail, and print services for all businesses in TD Bank. Eric, without further ado, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Diana, and welcome to those of you joining us today as we dissect why frontline managers are so busy and look at an alternative approach to help in alleviating this issue. As Diana mentioned, my name is Eric Sharp, and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. I'll get to our agenda in a moment, but first, I'd like to share with you the objective of today's discussion. There are 4 key points you should take away in the next 35 to 40 minutes. We're going to identify why people feel they don't have time to change the way they work. You'll come to understand how you overcome the common reasons why firefighting is often the approach. We're going to help you to identify where your organization is positioned on a recognized capability maturity model. And you'll also learn an alternative method that allows frontline managers to identify latent capacity and gain control. Let's take a quick look at today's agenda, and then we'll get started. First things first, we'll dig into why frontline managers are so busy. Then we're going to identify where technology fits in. We'll also introduce the concept of breakthrough thinking and why you should care. Then we're going to be joined by Richard Jeffrey, co-founder of Active Operations Management International, who will help us to understand more about how to gain control by applying a methodology. We're also going to hear from our special guest, Arvind Imanini, who's the Senior VP and Head of Deposit Operations at TD Bank. Arvind's going to share some experience from his team's rollout of the Active Operations method. We'll then discuss what value implementing this type of methodology can bring. And finally, we're going to answer the most common questions. With that, let's get started. So let's be honest with each other. We've probably all said those 3 little words that mean so much. And no, not I love you, even though we've said those words. I'm referring to the other 3 words. I'm too busy. And we've said them for many different reasons, ranging from solicitors who, by the way, many times have solutions that might help, and they ask us from time to time to show you their wares, to coworkers and managers asking for assistance on a project, to just dealing with the basics of your job description. The reality is that we just get caught up in trying to make it through every day, meeting our SLAs. So let's break this down a bit, and I'm sure I'll feel the breeze from you shaking your heads in unison as I walk you through this. Commonly, frontline managers end up dealing with non-managerial and administrative tasks, or in meetings that never seem to end. Or you find the organizational method, should you have one in place, has you doing many more things than you might think necessary. So when you finally do have a minute to attend to your team and how well they're doing their tasks, often you end up not really knowing. Additionally, your management is pulling you in different directions or struggling themselves with what the most important priority might be. And based on the inability to set those priorities, Unrealistic demands are made of managers that aren't achievable using current approaches. And here's a hint. Typically, there's no consistent methodology in place. An example of this is very commonly the need to reduce staff, but to continue to meet those quality and service levels. So let's take this a step further and assume your staff has already been reduced. Now, you've got a disproportionate amount of work for the staff that still remains, and reports tend to come in too late to be actionable. Collaboration is near impossible, and the staff that does remain is too busy to engage with each other to coordinate the work appropriately. This is the point where you break out the sirens and the fire hoses. It's where the organization breaks into crisis management mode. And this isn't the case for all, but we've certainly found it's the case for many. It's firefighting 101, where activities that a frontline manager does are often based on a reaction, not a plan. You know how to put the fires out, but with minimum control or use of a method in how to prevent the fires, how can you get to a point where you stop firefighting? And I hope all of this sounds familiar and that you understand that you're not alone in dealing with this day-to-day frustration of doing the job of your staff in order to keep your team above water. But there's even more to this story than just the stress of the day-to-day. Each and every service operation we've come across has a love affair with technology. And who can blame them? If automation of a process can reduce cost and alleviate human contact while maintaining SLAs or, quite honestly, even improving upon them, that's a good thing, right? Well, the answer to that is yes and no. Once you drill down and look at what the implementation of technology means, there is always risk involved in rolling out new systems. For example, will it work the way they told us it would? And what if it doesn't? Cost is always an issue, along with, in many cases, implementation being multiple-year projects. So now, let's cut to the chase. You've applied all the technology. You've paid for it. You've felt all the pain of implementation. And now, you still have a significant amount of the work remaining to be handled by people. How are you going to match up the work to the people and optimize that piece? We're not saying that technology is bad, because it's not. But you need to have a management method in place to achieve higher standards of productivity. Additionally, where many have thought to offshore when faced with this final piece, implementing a methodology such as active operations management can address it before you give away your profit. Okay, technology is good. We can agree on that, and we can probably also agree it's not the answer to everything. But let's take this a step further and think about the remaining work that technology doesn't support that I was just mentioning. If we can't use software to enact change on that last piece, what if we applied brainware? In his book, It Worked for Me in Life and Leadership, former United States Secretary of State Colin Powell stated, "Adapting to new technologies brings with it many challenges. It's one thing to install new hardware and software. It's far more difficult to change people's brainware. Even if your people have at their fingertips the latest computers, internet connections, smartphones, iPads, and data crunching systems, their heads and hearts may remain in the 20th century or earlier." So to translate, he's stating what we already know, but never think about. We, as humans, get set in our ways and don't want to change. Even if there is a better way, we fight the idea of doing things differently. Think about it. Have you ever said to yourself, this is the way we do it, and it's worked for us so far, or something similar to that? Even though we're hesitant to change, sometimes changing is required to meet the successes we need to achieve in today's environments. So how can we change this cycle? How can we stop chasing our tails? It's easy to make the case that doing the same thing produces the same outcomes. Bottom line, opening ourselves up to thinking differently and embracing change can take us, our teams, and overall corporate operations to a place that it never seemed possible. So, okay, now I'm sure you're probably saying to yourselves that this guy is blowing smoke, but it's not smoke. Let's define breakthrough thinking. It is the deliberate, focused effort aimed at developing atypical new approaches that overcome constraints instead of making incremental changes in the older ways of working. Now, I realize that's a lot of words, and quite honestly, I'm a visual learner and thinker myself. So why don't we take a look at this more visually? Look at this chart. The red arrow is typical behavior, moving back and forth between business as usual and crisis. But instead of doing things the same way, what if you started taking those crisis moments and began to think differently about how to handle them? An atypical approach that gets you to a new reality as opposed to business as usual. The active operations management methodology is breakthrough thinking for service operations. So I hope you're starting to get excited about what we're talking about. The new reality that by applying a consistent methodology, you'll create the breakthrough thinking that will enable you to achieve productivity improvements typically not less than 20%. An example of thinking differently would be command and control, which is top-down management, or central control, where one team is responsible for all of the priorities and who will do them, versus frontline control, where you provide your frontline managers with a method that enables full control and accountability at the most effective point in the organization. So now let's do a little quiz in your head. What changes to your management method have you applied lately? Have they been incremental changes in older ways of working, or have they been breakthrough thinking? For example, do you apply the same management method across all work types? Once you know and understand where you operate as an organization today, you'll be better positioned to put yourself into breakthrough mode. Okay, so now that we've covered why you're too busy and have given some thought to a new way of thinking, I'd like to introduce Richard Jeffrey, co-founder of Active Operations Management International, also referred to as AOMI. AOMI applies breakthrough thinking through a methodology practiced by frontline managers. Richard, thanks for joining us, and please, if you could, share some additional insight into the approach.
Eric, thank you very much, and good to speak. On the screen in front of you now, we put up what we use at AOMI as part of the way of giving organizations and managers a sense of perspective on their level of capability in this subject area in operations management. The interesting thing about operations management, I guess, is it's a bit like driving a car. I mean, most of us do it. Probably most of us like to think we're above average, right? But if we're honest, the truth is we know there's a world of difference between my journey to the office and the kind of skill and performance that a racing driver achieves. So this is one of the ways we help organizations to understand some of the different levels of capability. And what I thought I'd do, Eric, to take it from you, is to talk through, if you like, some of the key boundary markers. We haven't got time to go through it in any detail, but some of the key features that I look for in organizations between those different stages. Just looking at level one and level one to start with, this circle is a fairly classic symptom of a level one organization. Is control is exerted, is affected by measurement. There's a focus on scorekeeping, and managers very particularly will have their own way of measuring. You'll have the underwriting department that's got its counts, and we'll have the claims department that has a different way of counting. And the crucial bit here is to be able to use that information and to know what good and bad is. Very often you have to have worked in that department or that team for a long time, and that makes people very important to the process of control, because unless you've been in those areas, you don't necessarily know what the numbers mean. Also, there tends to be a bit partial, so you'll tend to focus on service levels rather than a more rounded set of measures. And it's something that organizations struggle with in terms of actually aligning work and their capacity. Just moving on to level two, in this capability, you'll find organizations now have an appreciation, have formally developed sense of what it takes to be in control. So you'll find units that do central planning. They'll have ways of doing operational capacity and loading. But very often, and this is a key sign for me of a level 2 area, this is a specialist discipline. You'll find a central planning unit. And very often the role of your team leaders and your operational managers is largely one of execution. Their job is to take a schedule and make sure their people are turning up and schedule adhering to the work. And that gives a level of control, and certainly you'll see this in big call centers, but it really struggles in our increasingly messy world where we're handling different types of work and in parallel, where some work needs to be done today, but other work can carry over for 5 days. And that kind of variety makes that kind of central control very, very difficult. As the Soviet Union found in the 80s, there's limits to that kind of central planning, and we need to find better ways of moving it on. So moving on to a level 3 organization. Now, a level 3 organization is one where the focus is less and less about technology and is much more about having consistency of approach. So although the work might be different across a whole range of different teams and operations, the actual principles used for control will be consistently applied. So there will be a recognition of the need for training and development in operations management. There'll be people with different levels of skill, but the magic indicator for me is that skill has become a generic capability, so that individuals, and this is a key test, individuals are able to be moved around and they can pick up the reins of different functional units because the way you run your teams is the same. So if I'm moving from the claims department to the underwriting department, the production report, which has my work and my time and my KPIs, has the same information as I've experienced elsewhere. And anyone else in the organization would be able to read my approach to capacity planning because essentially the principles are the same. So that's a key stage where, and I think that's probably the breakout stage, where we've moved from localized, specialist, different approaches to control to an organization which is essentially saying operations management is too important to leave to well-intentioned or perfectly good approaches, but with variety, but we've moved to consistency across the organization. Now, level 4 is where, because now operations has that kind of consistent rigor and approach across its operations, other supporting parts of our organization can now work with us more easily. So, for example, you get the HR department creating contracts of employment and terms and conditions which are designed to exploit the operational needs of the department and the operation, rather than perhaps being in isolation. You see the finance function relying on operations data to drive budgeting. You see the sales department within an operation interfacing much more effectively with the operations because they share a common approach to numbers and where and how plans are drawn up. Now, in level 5 organizations, that's a stage further on. This is where your consistency of operational control can now be extended up and down your supply chain. So, for example, many of our clients in banks are now requiring their outsourced contractors to adopt the same principles in order that at the operational level, team leaders and managers on either side of the organizational boundary share a common language, they plan and control to a common rigor, so that for both sides, they minimize contingency, they avoid shocks, and essentially it's one of a trusted part of a supply chain, rather than each party in the chain having to carry pockets of spare capacity to avoid being embarrassed by service levels. So there's a scale there, and we'll come back to later, there's more data available on that, but we find that a useful rigor to understand where organizations are currently at. Now let's look in a bit more detail, because Eric's made some reference to some quite large capacity and control gains. What we typically find if we move on is that most organizations suffer from the curse or the blessing of variable workloads. And in level 1 and level 2 organizations, you'll often find the primary measure of performance is service level. So what does that mean? Well, it means essentially that teams with their resources have to control their work, by work expanding and contracting to the available time. So if you look at your productivity of your teams, what you'll see is a picture like on the screen there now, where the work rate is clearly being driven by the pressure of the moment, the pressure of the work. Now, that essentially, that's a very simple piece of analysis, and I would commend it to anybody who's listening, because if you see that, what that tells you is for all the tools and frameworks you have in place, perhaps you have benchmarks, perhaps you've got work study, what that tells you is your work is driving your productivity. It's not an actively managed variable. So what's the significance? Well, let me tell you that based on the moving perhaps from a level 2 to a level 3 capability where we take control, we give our team leaders that kind of breakout mechanisms for them to start matching their capacity to the work rather than carrying just-in-case resources for the work they might get, typically realizes between 25 and 40% extra capacity. And the crucial bit about that is that's within the constraints of their existing processes. So for those of us which have got lean and other re-engineering type processes going on where we're looking to make further improvements through efficiency and stage, this is something purely supplementary to that, because this is the capacity to regulate the capacity for a level 1 or a level 2 organization to essentially achieve between 25 and 40% extra capacity within their existing processes. Now you add in new approaches to technology into that, and you have some very exciting numbers indeed. But you could almost reverse the argument there. If you drop a new process or you drop a performance improvement project into an environment where productivity is varying like we saw, ask yourself, are we likely to see the full benefit of that change? And the answer, I think, is fairly evidently from a lot of the workflow and technology projects we've seen that very often benefits have not been realized, not because there's anything fundamentally wrong with the technology, but because the process operations management around it hasn't enabled the new managers to drive out the benefits we're expecting. So how do you do that? Well, let me tell you a bit about what we think, and you can think, extrapolate it for your own consideration. Essentially, we break the problem down to try and turn a mystery into a bit of a puzzle, to use a good phrase. On the picture there, you'll see really the heart of our approach. Essentially, it starts with perhaps something that's self-evident, but all too often doesn't work in practice. That essentially the goal of the operations manager is to deliver quality and service at the lowest possible cost. In other words, they have all 3 dimensions to worry about. And a simple test you could apply in any of your operations is to ask them what they monitor, because very often the key KPI that people will monitor is the service level. And quality, and perhaps particularly this resourcing, follows as a consequence rather than being an actively managed variable. So start from that. The second is, it's all about the behavior. As Eric described earlier, technology has its place, and I'll touch on that in a second, but we're talking here about what do you do to create the behaviors so that your managers at all the operational levels feel equipped and are able to make good decisions to control those 3 dimensions. So let's drill in a bit further. What's that involve? Well, our view is you can look at this through 3 different components, which taken together give you your capability. And let's start with something we've touched on already, method. Our suggestion is, and what we see in the organizations which have really good practice around this, is they treat their management control method, the way in which their team leaders and operational managers work together to plan, control, report, and review, as a serious business process. They treat it with the same rigor that you would treat your new business process or your claims process. Because it goes across all your other activities, it is not something to be left to chance or the particular preference of individuals within a particular team. It is a structural, strategic asset of the business. So taking the time and trouble to map out how you want those things done, right from the daily buzz meeting through to the weekly planning, through to the longer-term planning process, it's important, it's even critical that you describe how you want that done so that I, as an individual, can play my part in that process. Second, if I'm going to be doing that process for you, I need to have the skills. The bizarre statistic that we carried out some research in a number of outsourcers recently, And in business process operations outsourcing, more managers have got qualifications in project management than operations management. Not many organizations even have a formal operations management skill development, which when you think about what their day job is quite startling. So operations management, and I'm talking here about the skills like forecasting and planning and so on, are skills to be taught. Of course, many managers, because we're recruiting the right people, are gifted at this, but this is something which we can't leave to the gifted amateur. As a business capability, we need to develop it. And then we get to the third component. The reason we don't do more of this is because very often it's difficult or messy or complicated. And this is what tools give us. You need the right tools to support the managers with the skills to give themselves the control. But it's that way around. I don't think anyone here probably listening would argue that giving me Microsoft Project will make me a gifted project manager. On the other hand, if I know how to run projects, any project management tool will probably help me do my job better. So the role of achieving control for the tools is to provide the consistency and rigor and support to make the job as easy as possible to do. So that's how we break down the problem into something which organizations can manage to ultimately lift their performance. So let me end by showing you that picture. So what we're saying very much is that marrying up of resources and workload is not something to be left by chance. It shouldn't just be a cloud. By the introduction of some rigor and some support, you can achieve that breakthrough thinking where organizations take control of how this is done and deliver some startling improvements in productivity, simply by defining it and starting to treat it as a key business process. And for many organizations, they're starting to approach this as a strategic capability. It's something which can differentiate themselves from other organizations. Because as I think this nice cartoon neatly describes, the issue surely out there is not whether or not we're doing this already, it's about how well we're doing it relative to the competition. Eric, back to you.
Richard, that was great. I really appreciate the overview, and I'm sure everyone has a better grasp now of the principles behind the idea of active operations and its method. But now, let's delve into the real world a little bit. So here are actual results of some of AOM's U.S. and Canadian clients, and there are very similar results in service centers throughout the world. Now, each of these lines represent the productivity improvement that's achieved by various departments or lines of business, and each line represents groups of approximately 125 to 300 FTE. So in total, they represent over 3,000 FTE. Now, the really neat thing about this is that the method is agnostic to the type of work being done. So these are actual results in productivity improvements just from frontline managers and supervisors improving their ability to match resources to load by applying the active operations management method and skills. Active operations management also has a quality objective to get clients to a 30% productivity improvement by the 15-month point, and then ensure that those benefits are sustained moving forward. Now, think about this. At an annualized FTE cost of about $50,000 a head and getting to that 30% productivity improvement, these results equate to an annual savings of about $45 million. So let's take real world a step further. I'd like to introduce Arvind Imanini, Senior Vice President of Operations at TD Bank, who currently has multiple teams involved with the active operations management method. Arvind, thank you for your time and for joining us today.
Eric, thank you for having me.
Let's start with some basics, Arvind, for everybody. What is your background and why did TD Bank choose to adopt the active operations management method?
Yes, as a quick introduction or background about myself, I have been in financial services for about 15 years and have been in operations and process improvement type of roles for a good part of those 15 years. I also have a background in Six Sigma as a master black belt and have done a lot of work in implementing operational excellence type of improvement capabilities in various business units. Coming to AOM in particular, when I first heard of AOM, and learned about the principles and the benefits, it was exactly the kind of system and process that I was looking for to implement in my operational units. Specifically, what I liked about AOM is the ability to track and manage capacity and forecast demand at a unit level and be able to use all the resources that we have more effectively to deliver a better outcome both for our business as well as for our internal customers.
Great. Now, one of the things and one of the concepts that we've touched on so far is the idea of breakthrough thinking. Do you find that active operations management is a different way of thinking?
Absolutely. So, there are several examples of how AOM has changed, the way we think about our operations and our teams. A great example is that our teams don't view the work of that they perform as their work only, or rather, going a step further, they view the entire operations unit's work as their work, and I think that is breakthrough thinking for me because we are now operating at a level where we can flex staff across multiple operational units and do it almost in real time. In an environment where that was not feasible before without the AOM principles and system.
Understood. So did you have to overcome internal organization norms in order to get buy-in to the idea of doing this?
Absolutely. So, the first hurdle for us was, is this a cost-cutting measure, right? And are you, there was skepticism as to why we were doing this. The second hurdle that we had to overcome was this concept of, my work, if I'm able to get my work done, how does it matter how I use my time, right? And then the third thing really was around the whole the focus on measuring. There was a sense that the big brother is watching us, and are we really getting any benefit from the amount of time we're spending on measuring all of these activities and time? As the organization went through the changes, the principles, the 11-week course, and later implemented it, the AOM practices, and then move forward, I think in a couple of months, one by one, I think the skeptics or the naysayers start to turn around because they starting to see the benefits. And I think that's where, I think the real grassroots adoption of these principles happened in our operations.
Right. So as you see it, Arvind, what has the overall experience been and what have the results looked like since the introduction of AOM?
Yeah, we now we're about just about a year into our journey on AOM, a full year. So I think we can speak with confidence on some of the results. The first one is, so to begin with, we have about 450 associates roughly in my organization that, the part of my organization that does true back office type of work is whom we put on AOM. So from that scale, about 450 employees in my organization, and in total today about 700 employees across bank operations are on AOM. And then within that, within this time frame, in the first year of implementation, we have seen our productivity improve by about 16%. And this, to us, to our bottom line, equates to about $1.4, $1.5 million in either cost savings or cost avoidance. The other thing, so that is the most tangible of benefits that you can actually measure, touch, and second benefit that we have had is that we instituted a metric internally, which is the percentage of our associates that are cross-trained on 3 or more functions. To me, this metric is very critical because it enhances or it demonstrates the the skill level of your organization and the flexibility of your organization. I'm very pleased to say about 80% of my organization is now cross-trained on 3 or more functions. And our goal is to get to 100% this year for any associate who's been with us for more than 6 months. And that actually in itself enables us, for one, to compensate our associates better because we can actually tangibly measure what they're bringing to the table versus before. We have a measurement system that actually differentiates for performance and be very objective in how we handle performance management. So that's the second benefit. The third benefit really is around disaster recovery. So what we have found is that we have several units within the operation that are actually only in one single site. With AOM and with the cross-training now, we have now, with the ability to actually use that capacity in other sites to help an operation that was in a different location, we have been effectively able to create a disaster recovery plan for all of our functions, even though they only had one site to begin with. So we didn't have to actually build an extra site for some of those functions, but we cross-trained associates at other locations on those critical functions, and thereby now we have the necessary disaster recovery capabilities. So those to me are the 3 biggest drivers of value, and overall I couldn't be happier with the results after the first year.
That's wonderful. So with all that you've just shared, are there any other next steps that TD Bank is looking to take?
Yeah, TD Bank, by the end of this year, will have about, TD Bank as a whole will have about, I believe, close to 1,500 associates on AOM. And this is the TD Bank in the U.S. Globally, the TD Bank Group will have over 3,000 associates on AOM, and the benefits and the impact that it is going to have on us and our organization is going to be tremendous. And I haven't, in my years of experience in process improvement, I have not seen another example of a cultural transformation and continuous improvement program that has had this big an impact on an organization.
Great. So I think you've partially answered my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway to hopefully drill down and get a little more specific. You mentioned that there will be about 3,000 FTE globally across TD Bank using AOM. Can you drill down and tell me more about what the other parts of the TD organization are that have adopted active operations management?
Yeah, in fact, we adopted this after our colleagues in Canada, who were the first ones to adopt. So our TD Canada Trust, which is a division of TD Bank Group in Canada, and their operational groups in branch services center, in deposit operations, in loan servicing, and mortgage originations, and fraud and collections. All of those groups in the TD Bank TD Canada Trust in Canada have gone on AOM over the last 2 years. Within TD Bank US, we now have plans for debit operations, loan operations, consumer lending operations, retail lending operations, payment operations, fraud, collections, and deposit operations. So when you add all of these up, I think it'll be between 3,000 and 4,000 associates by the end of next year that will be on AOM.
Great. Arvind, thank you so much for taking the time to share some of your experiences with our attendees today. I really believe you've provided some invaluable examples of how applying breakthrough thinking can achieve tremendous results. Thanks again.
You're welcome.
So let's review what we've just covered and the benefits that are achievable when implementing a methodology such as active operations management. By taking that next step and bringing the components of technology, tools, and skills together, you'll develop a high-performing culture. You'll find that now you're in a position to think atypically and develop that new reality. You'll have the ability to recognize and utilize hidden capacity, which in many cases was right in front of your nose previously, and then use it before it sunk cost. You'll also find productivity improvements of 20 to 40% within months, and most exciting in most cases is the first 10% occurs within weeks. And everyone within the organization is now going to have visibility into your operations, and you'll have actual accountability, operational control, flexibility, and agility. And these are just some of the benefits that a method such as this brings. We're about to wrap things up. But before we do, I want to share some insights from a well-known author speaker by the name of Tom Peters. A number of months back, I had the privilege to sit in on one of Mr. Peters' seminars, and I really found it quite interesting in that he was promoting many similar principles regarding frontline supervisors. And these are 5 questions that he asked that I believe you should really be thinking about. And let's walk through them. They are, number 1, are you a formal student of first-line supervisor behavioral excellence? And one of the things he pointed out was that, yeah, you really can formally study something like this. Second, do you absolutely understand and act upon the fact that the first-line boss is the key leadership role in the organization? Having the technical mastery is great, but really secondary. Third, do you have the absolute best training and continuing development programs in the industry for your first-line supervisors? Fourth, do you formally and rigorously mentor those first-line supervisors? And finally, are your first-line supervisors accorded the respect that the power of their position merits? These are all very important questions, and if you haven't considered them today, now might be a good time to delve into the benefits of this way of thinking. Okay, we're just about done. But first, a few final thoughts by way of typical questions asked regarding the active operations management method. And to help answer these, I'm going to ask for Richard Jeffrey's assistance once again. So, Richard, one of the typical questions heard regarding the active operations management approach is, aren't I doing this already? And how do you answer that?
Well, obviously, organizations are. I mean, out there today, team leaders working hard, taking instruction, doing the best they can within the resources available to them. But to my last point, the issue is there's a world of difference between one person doing it the way they can and us systematically and thoroughly doing it really, really well. It's essentially a strategic asset for the business. So the challenge is not so much are we or not, or are we not. The issue is more about how well we can do it and what opportunities does that create for us to exploit our types of work, our particular processes and systems, our particular products, so that we can differentiate ourselves in the market. We can buy a faster engine, but we still got to drive the car really, really, really well.
Got it. So another typical question revolves around the movement of resources and how often they actually get moved between teams.
That's a really good question because, in a sense, that's one of the key indicators. So when you ask organizations, does this happen? Many people would say, yes, we do that. But when you drill in a little bit deeper, what you'll find is it tends to be occasional in some cases, but perhaps more importantly, very reactive. So it tends to be a distress response to a presenting issue. And one of those key differentiators for me from perhaps a level 2 to a level 3 organization is where, because common sense tells us that the resources we have in a given team, given the variability of our incoming work, is going to be wrong more days than it's right. When you see that kind of routine, proactive allocation of work across teams, that's a sign of an organization that's moved into the big league in terms of operations management.
Got it. Now, also, I think we've covered this a bit in our overview, but let's dig a little deeper on how would one of our listeners today determine what they're currently at on the capability maturity model?
Well, some of the assets and some of the questionnaires that we use are available on the website. So, any audience are very welcome to, if they just let us have an email address, and we'll send them the diagnostic toolkit here. Because for me, operations management is like a hidden opportunity. For most organizations, they are thinking about expensive technologies, anything we can do here to highlight this as a source of strategic advantage is a good thing. And so some of those questionnaires and the information's there to be had, and it's got to help just give a sense of perspective on ops as an opportunity for performance improvement.
Right. And finally, we talked earlier about technology and how long, in some cases, technology takes to implement. A lot of people are always asking, how long does it take to implement a new method like this?
Well, I think you've already covered it. I mean, because it doesn't essentially involve a whole lot of changes to processes. This is all about coaching people to extend and develop and do what they're already doing better. I mean, you're talking about introducing a rigor to planning within 4 or 5 weeks, starting to move resources so you get a noticeable uplift in 6 or 7 weeks. I mean, I think the average return after 4 months is over 10%, Eric. So, this is not big bucks, high investment. This is investment in the capability of our managers, which yields very quickly. I think the average return on investment of our projects is greater than 200% within a year. So, this is not high investment, high cost projects, or indeed high risk.
Got it. Well, thanks again for your time in answering these questions, Richard. So before we go, I'd like to thank our special guest, Arvind Imanini of TD Bank, for his time and insight today, as well as Richard Jeffrey, co-founder of Active Operations Management International, for his overview of how AOM's methodology can help us break the cycle of being too busy. We hope you found this webinar informative, and if you'd like to get more information on how to self-assess on the capability maturity model, please visit the Active Operations website at www.activeops.com/US. Additional contact information is on the screen now, and please note that this webinar will be available for rebroadcast on both the IQPC and the Active Operations Management websites. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the near future for another in our series of webinars focusing on improving productivity within service operations. I'm Eric Sharp. Have a great day.
Thanks, Eric, Richard, and Arvind, and thank you also to everyone watching today's webinar. That does conclude today's presentation, but don't forget that to see a schedule of our upcoming webinars or process excellence events, log on to www.pexnetwork.com.